directions and future research trajectories. Today, we are here to acquire more knowledge and have more stimulating discussions with many amazing speakers. And to start the wonderful day ahead of us, I would like to thank and welcome the Honorable Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences UIN Sunan Gunung Jati Bandung, Bapak Profesor Ahmad Ali Nurdin, the Honorable Vice Deans of the Faculty, Bapak Dr. Muhammad Dulki MSI, Bapak Profesor Adon Nasrullah Jamaluddin, and Bapak Dr. Muhammad Sultin MSI. Also to our Director of Center of Asian and Social Science Research, Bapak Asep Muhammad Iqbal, PhD. And to our keynote speaker, Assistant Professor Renyi Hong. And to all the participants today, I will also thank you for your participations and attendance. First and foremost, before we start, I will share with you our agenda for today's conference. Today, we will start our conference with a welcoming remarks from our directors, Bapak Asep Muhammad Iqbal, and followed by our main agenda, presentations from our keynote speaker, and then continued by one parallel sessions, and then we will have a break for Zuhur prayer, and after we will continue the next 3 parallel sessions after the break. To mark the start of our agenda, I would like to welcome Bapak Asep Muhammad Iqbal to deliver the welcoming remarks. To Bapak Asep, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Bu Farah. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sampurasun. It's my privilege and honor to welcome all of you all to this conference, the second Bandung International Conference on Social Science. And special welcome to our guest speaker, invited speaker, Professor Renyi Hong. Thank you very much for coming, Renyi. Yeah. And I would like to extend our dean's gratitude and welcome to you, especially Renyi. He is not able to come this morning because he has something to do. He's busy this morning, so he can't attend this conference. But he send you salam. He sends you a welcome to this conference. Okay. This year, the conference is held for 2 days. This is the second days. We did the first day yesterday on 9th, and today is our second day of conference, the 10th of August. We still doing our conference online. And in this conference, we will be discussing the main theme on contemporary issues and trends in digital society. We pick up the theme digital society and a global south, a critique of knowledge production and future research trajectories. I think I need to explain this a bit further. Digital technology has a significant impact on everyone's life and future, but many individuals, particularly those in global south, are left out of discussion on the direction of digital society. This inequality is a structural issue with real-world roots. This issue is known as digital coloniality. This conference will explore the problems with current studies on digital society, a critique of knowledge production on digital society, and possibilities of future research direction which recognize global cognitive justice. We are happy, we are pleasure, we are pleased to have distinguished events keynote speaker in this conference. In two keynote speech session, we had one yesterday in our first conference. We had Professor Merlyana Lim yesterday, and she had delivered a very exciting and inspiring presentation. And for today, we have Professor Renyi Hong from Department of Communication New Media, National University of Singapore, and he already sent us his interesting and insightful slide. and we hope you will enjoy and take benefit from his presentation. This conference also present to you panel discussion which consists of 8 sessions. We had the first 8 sessions yesterday, around 4 sessions a day. There are 41 accepted abstract out of 90 submitted abstract that will be presented and discussed in this session within today's conference. And there are more than 100 registered users participating in this conference. I think this is going to be long and perhaps tiring, but I think will be a rewarding conference for all of you all. And for your information, selected full papers will be published in our journal, Journal of Asian Studies and Research, JISPO Journal Ilmu Sosial Ilmu Politik and Politikons. Papers that are not selected for publication within this journal would be published in our conference proceeding published by our center. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I also would like to extend my sincere thanks to those who greatly helped in organizing this conference, the Dean of our faculty, Professor Amalinuddin, and Vice Deans. And also my thanks goes to the head and secretaries of Department of Sociology, Public Administration, and Political Science, and the CSR team and the conference committee. I'm sure that you will have fruitful and rewarding exchange today within today's conference. I wish you every success with this conference, and I look forward to learning about the outcomes. I wish you all a successful conference. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sampurasun.
Okay, thank you to Papa Asep. Now, without further ado, we will start our main agenda, which is the presentation of our keynote speaker. And today I also received the honor to become the moderator for our main discussions. Forgive me that let me introduce myself. My name is Farah Saira Zahra. And for today conference, we have keynote speaker with us, Mr. Renyi Hong, and we have been given an opportunity from this conference to be able to absorb the abundance of knowledge. And today we have another opportunities to receive even more knowledge and insight. And as our main agenda in this conference is to scrutinize the digital society and the global south, a critique of knowledge productions and future research trajectories. Today we have a sounding speaker who will share with us about portability and digital coloniality. And the Assistant Professor Renyi Hong from the National University of Singapore. Before we start with his presentations, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker by sharing his amazing background. So Assistant Professor Renyi Hong has received his PhD from the University of Southern California. And as soon as he finished his PhD in 2017, he works as an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. He also has a very long list of publications, with the most recent one on plasticity accounting for adaptations in social technical system. Assistant Professor Renyi Hong is not only active in the field of education research, he also provides his service at the NTUC as a consultant and work in a fair work group to help create a fairer work conditions. Moreover, he received several awards and was invited as a speaker at many events. So today we are very lucky to have such an amazing speaker with us. And I will feel honored to be able to welcome him to this conference. However, before we start, I would like to share to all the participants the rundown of today's discussion. First, our keynote speaker will share the 60 minutes of his presentation. And then we will have 25 minutes of discussions for all the participants who would like to ask questions. And Mr. Reni, I will provide you a reminder of time in the last 5 and 1 minutes of the presentation. So without further ado, I know that we must be very eager to start. And now I will welcome our first speaker, Assistant Professor Reni Hong, and the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Farah. I just want to, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much. Really honored to be here. And I think this conference is so meaningful, so important because knowledge production from the global south is really key, I think, towards addressing the long-standing colonial relations that our world is sort of being trapped in. And I think under conditions of climate change, global inequality, knowledge production from the global south has never been more important. So I'm really honored to be here. Very also happy to see my Southeast Asian colleagues. Don't have a lot of opportunities to do that, so really happy to have the chance to do this. So let me share my slides for today. Moment. Okay. So the story today that I'm going to tell really centers about the story of portable computer technologies and digital coloniality. So I'm a critical scholar of work. In other words, a lot of my scholarship centers around work and labor. And this project originally started off as a project looking at digital nomads in actually Bali and also in Thailand, right? Since then, it expanded, and I am sort of been thinking about this project in different ways. But I came to this project also led by the very provocative term that was sort of sets the tone for this project, digital coloniality, right? So maybe just let me start off talking about what does digital coloniality mean, right? On the one hand, digital coloniality speaks of a neo-colonial moment, right? So if European colonialism began in the 19th century, extended to the mid-20th century, right? Then what digital coloniality also says is that our colonial relations is not over. Of course, the sort of colonial moment has changed, but the sort of power relations of colonialism still remains with us, right? So what leaves us with is that we have to understand the moment, the sort of historical moment that we're living in, the sort of conjuncture that we are living in, right? And this conjuncture, as has been pointed out, is also tied to the digital. So what is the digital? On the one hand, the digital refers to technologies, right? We are familiar with the internet, we are familiar with computers, we are familiar with programs, software, apps, so on. Those constitute the digital. But in a way, in another sense, digital also refers to something not tangible, right? It is something atmospheric, something that is harder to see, right? Which is why my image at the start here is the image of the clouds. I want to suggest that if we want to think about digital coloniality, we have to think a little bit about the legacies of colonialism left with us that is now embedded in the worlds we live that cannot be narrowed down to just a technology. Okay, so let me I also talk about this story over 3 parts. Okay, so I will cover 3 stories of portability. Okay, I will start with in the 1980s with the American Road Warrior. So this was the period where portable computers, or today what we call laptops, right, were invented. Right. And interestingly enough, these laptops were invented precisely for use on airplanes. Okay, I want to cover this initial part of this intriguing history because a lot of us don't know it, right? We get a laptop, we just use it. In fact, laptops were originally often designed for airplanes. I want to start off thinking about that, to have us think about what exactly is portability. What does portability do, right? And I want to suggest at the heart of portability isn't just about things being able to move around, right? Laptops being able to move around, phones being able to move around. But the heart of portability is the issue of how are we going to transform environments so that things can be moved around, right? So I'll elaborate on that in that first story. In the second story, I would then move in the 90s to Japanese engineers, right? I started looking at Japanese engineers through this book, Digital Nomad. Some of you might be familiar with this book, right? But most of the time, it is often discussed as, in relation to the modern day moment of the digital nomad. But the 90s period, then this book was written. This book was not written for ordinary consumers, like people like you and me using laptops. No, this book was written to engineers. So I wanted to sort of discuss in the 90s how semiconductor chips, right, became a way for Japanese engineers to imagine the global south, right? So 80s and 90s were a period of imagining about what frontiers, what global south looks like. Then I want to come to my more recent work with digital nomads in the 2000s. In that, I want to sort of talk about what does it mean? What do these legacies, right, of digital coloniality mean for the modern moment with digital nomadism? And I'm going to especially focus here on the issue of climate change, right, in 2000s. So let me begin with this story, all right? By talking about another different story, actually. This time, a story of photographing eclipses, okay? So this is the magazine Byte. It's a very influential magazine in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, right? And it was at a point of time when it was published in the 1970s, one of the most popular magazines for people who use computers, right? Now, in this particular issue, right, Carl Helmus is the editor of Byte, right, writes about his experience photographing eclipses. Now, this was a very major thing, okay? Because what happens is that in the periods before the 70s, essentially, computers were these huge, bulky machines, right? So if in the 60s, around the 60s, 50s period, computers were these big machines that were largely owned only by American military institutions, American and British military institutions. Also, they were used only for calculations, right? So they weren't things that people actually ordinarily used for, games or even to surf the net. I mean, all these things did not exist, right? So computers were just these alien machines, okay? Somewhere in the 1970s, computers started to shift, right? They became mass consumer products, right? And they gradually became smaller. So in the 1970s is the moment where you see one of your earliest desktop computers. Some of you may have them, right? Those with the CRT monitors, big desktop computers. They started coming in the 1970s. And also with Apple II. Now, Apple II is the image below here. What is interesting about Apple II is that it is actually a desktop. I know it looks a bit like a laptop here, but it's not. Okay, so there is no screen for one, right? You have to actually buy a monitor to put it on the Apple II, right? And there is no battery, so you have to connect it to a power supply, right? But even then, the Apple II was was to many people at the time was so dramatically much smaller that people considered it, portable, right? Compared to those huge computers. So basically what Helmus wanted to do was to photograph eclipses, right? And he wanted to do it outdoors, okay? And he wanted to automate it, right? He wanted to use computers to take better snapshots of these photographs. So he designed or sort of tinkered with Apple II and brought a power generator and things like that. And then he sort of managed to do it. Okay. Now, so this was his initial try. Now, about a year later, Helmus decided to do something more ambitious. He decided that, okay, he's going to go to Africa, Kenya. So he lives in the United States. He's going to go to Africa, Kenya in the 1970s now to photograph eclipses. Okay, so out of this story, out of his adventure, came a travelogue. Okay, when I call that travelogue, I'm describing it in the way that Helmut described it. He often went on conferences talking about his travels to Africa, to take these photos, and he sort of described his adventures. He says that he had to fend off lions, he had to fight off hippos, and it was extremely hot, so his Apple II was going to overheat. He had to put on tents, so it really became sort of a sort of colonial adventure, right, to bring his laptops to Africa. And one of the main things he also talked about was how difficult it was to bring his laptops across the customs, right? So he said that he needed to pay $4,000 for the equipment, followed by an extensive, tedious paperwork process that took 2 days to resolve, right? Now, so, he presented this at a conference, and then someone asked him, okay, so will you do this again, right? Now, interestingly, this is what he said. He said, so one of the things with the computer is that you have to be very careful going into the country, right? If it's in Southern California, I think I'm going to head there. I think I had it with, well, no, Kenya is a beautiful country, and I want to go back there sometime when it's not a trip for this kind of purpose. But the problem is that there were a lot of hassles with electronic equipment going through the customs thing, and I don't want to go through that again if I can avoid it. Now, quite interestingly, in Helmut's example, we see two really important issues that emerge. The first one is that when the computer became portable, it also created a situation of portability. In other words, Helmut did not think of going to Kenya prior to the computers being portable. When computers became portable, he thought of going to Kenya. And then after he went to Kenya, his critique was not really that the computer was not portable. The computer was definitely at a point of time with Apple II not really portable. I mean, it still needed a power generator, for instance. It's not easy to bring in. But his main issue was really with how unfriendly the environment was to the condition of portability. So I wanted to start off with this discussion, the relationship between the object and environment when we think about the word portability or the portable. When we think about portables, we often think about a quality that's inherent within the object. The laptop is portable, your phone is portable, things that are moving around, able to move around is portable. However, when you think about it, not only do the things need to be moved around, but the environment must accommodate them moving around, right? So that is the environmental notion of portability. Now, this idea of the environment being key to portability is something that is deeply embedded within computer science, especially. So when you look at the definition of portability in computer science, they talk about it not just about software, but about the environment that the software is embedded in. So an app is portable if it can be moved between Windows to Macintosh to Android and so on and so forth, right, to Linux. The environment is key to the experience of portability for the software. Now, as I also previously mentioned, right, these two qualities of object and environment do not exist statically. When an object is portable, it tends to create an incentive for the environment to become accommodating for the portable object. Similarly, when environments allow things to be moved across, they tend to encourage development of portable technologies. So a lot of my discussion in the next couple of slides, will really center around this logic of portability, right? How object and environment mutually push each other and encourage change in each other to create what I call a portable milieu, all right? So to let us go into this story, I want to start again 4 years later in Byte. Now, 4 years later, portable computers, now laptops, have been beginning to become a big industry, right? So magazines are trying to sell laptops, and Byte organized a special issue where they entirely wrote only on laptops, okay? Now, if you look at this cover, what is interesting you might observe is that they presented the use of portables in airplanes, right? So we kind of see them through the sort of windows of the airplanes. to understand the laptops, right? Now, at a point of time, these are not called laptops; they were called luggables, transportables, or portables. But nonetheless, right? The focus of airplanes is very clear and important. So why this connection? Why airplanes? So to understand this, we have to kind of understand two things, all right? First of all, how expensive these portable computers were, right? So at a point of time, if you were to buy this laptop with software, it will cost around 6,000 to 7,000 USD, right? So this is granted, this is about 40 years ago, right? So you can imagine that 6,000 to 7,000 USD, this is not something that only the typical person can afford, right? So this is something affordable only by the sort of very more wealthy businessmen, businesswomen, right? And the other thing was that at the time, flying was also largely reserved only for business executives, right? So half of the people who were traveling by planes at a period of time were not, consumers, people who bought air tickets like, for holidays kind of thing. No, it was largely business executives, right? So half of the travelers on the air were business executives. So this created a coincidence, right? Expensive portable machines were used by businessmen who were also people traveling in the air, right? Which sort of created how portable machines initially were very much marketed to in airplanes, right? Now, however, there was an issue with that, right? So this is the first page that describes the imagination of how business people can travel in the air. You flip open, the next page actually describes how you actually cannot use your airplanes while in the air. Use your portable computers while in the air. So at a point of time, they were actually very worried about electromagnetic interference, right? So this is a typical thing you encounter on a plane still, right? So as planes taking off, how you switch off your handphones, switch off your laptops. But at a point of time, it was entirely banned. You are not supposed to use these things at all, right? And so contrary to what the photo or what this image suggests, right? Most of the people who bought these computers were actually not able to use the laptops in the air, right? So the editor at the time, Lawrence Curran, tried to reassure readers, right? Remember, he was trying to sell these laptops. He was trying to reassure readers, saying, well, the regulation isn't strictly enforced. That it will be impossible to expect flight attendants and pilots to enforce it, right? But complaints about this issue continue to pour in even after FAA had classified laptops as safe for use in the air in 1984. Right, there were many kind of issues that emerged. Most notorious were altercations with customs officers, right? So customs officers were worried that there were bombs in these machines, right? And required people to open up the laptops. By open up, that doesn't mean flip open. They wanted to use the screwdrivers to take out all the screws and open the insides, things like that. People talk about being undignified, having to go on all fours, put the laptops on the floor to open it, so on and so forth, right? There were a lot of issues with bringing laptops in the air, right? And it was so problematic such that by 1992, in a New York Times article, would associate portability with an element of environmental hostility. All right. So this says people who travel with portable computers are sometimes called road warriors. Like the Mad Max character, they feel alone and surrounded by hostiles. Airport security won't let them on a plane until they can turn on a computer to show that it's not an explosive, but the battery just died and there's no spare available. The hotel telephone is wired so modem can be used. The disk containing the spiffy electronic slideshow is damaged and the only copy sits several thousand miles away on the network file server. So the road warrior, is a term borrowed from this really famous film at that time, right? Mad Max, right? The road warrior sort of is described is a term used for these early travelers, right? And a lot of early travelers sort of appropriated and believed in that term. And it described this kind of fearless, adaptable, adventurous, business executive, right? Who would take the laptops and go on to foreign places and then, be productive while they are flying, okay? So I'm going to sort of talk about this road warrior and talk about the significance of this road warrior for portability. But before I go into that, it might be useful to think about who the magazines were saying were not road warriors, right? So the 1980s period marked a sort of a period of a new beginning of job insecurity in the large parts of the West, right? So previously, job insecurity largely existed for blue-collar workers. But by the 90s, precariousness and insecurity started to move even upwards, right, to these business executives who were previously considered to have like, jobs that will never ever be threatened, right? And so in the 90s especially, a lot more of these people got retrenched, right? So the sort of this burgeoning period of insecurity coincided with this moment where people were also starting to buy portable computers, right? And you can see how advertisements tapped into the latent anxieties with this moment, right? So in the far right here, we have a advertisement, a jokey advertisement, right? Not real, but a jokey advertisement talking about how you can just buy a laptop case, right? So instead of putting a laptop in, you want to have the prestige, you buy a laptop case and you can put all your clothes in, right? So this was, again, poking fun at people who just wanted prestige, without having the competence to use laptops, right? In the image below, we see an ad, right? In this case, an incompetent executive is using a big CRT monitor and bothering other people, right? So people turning around, being irritated, and behind you see this so-called, I think more of a road warrior, right? This person who's like relaxed and just using his laptops well, right? Then in the far left, and a lot of this genre of advertisements are sort of laptops dropping, right? So in this case, people rushing for the airport sometimes and then their laptops, then their briefcase opening up, their laptop smashes to the ground. Now, the laptop smashing is not just a critique, just not just like a pointer of how your laptop was spoiled, but when things drop, it's about embarrassment, right? So a large part of this discourse here was tapping into these sort of insecurities of workers at the moment, right? So that like there was this sense of embarrassment as showing incompetence, right? Which is to again highlight the sort of the sort of importance of what a road warrior meant at this moment. So who is then the road warrior? Well, the road warrior is this person who then can go through all kinds of environments and still be productive. This is an adaptable individual. He can move from the home to another office, to the air, to another home, to a meeting room. He can move anywhere, right? And still look professional and polished, right? And a lot of ads at the moment was trying to play up this logic, right? So in this Apple ad, in particular, you see this executive, right, sort of using a laptop, but seemingly bothering other passengers because he is incompetent again, right? So he's using a mouse, and that the mouse is sort of bothering his sort of elbows are bothering other people. And then the next image shows the easy way, right? Then now you have a trackball, and a trackball allows you to sort of do your work in the air without bothering people, right? So anxieties of incompetence, of displays of incompetence in the air became a way by which the anxieties of unemployment or the anxieties of redundancy was sort of expressed within especially the West, right? Through these kinds of ads and through ideas about who the road warrior is. Right. So IT competencies using computers, right, steadily became indicative of one's adaptive competencies, right? And so as the downsizing ramped up in the 90s, these ads again became more and more common. Now, the thing about these road warriors, right? And the significant part about these road warriors was that quite early on again, these road warriors were already told that in order to do their to use their laptops well, they have to be adaptable. Being adaptable means being able to use their laptops across a variety of different settings, but it also means being able to change their environments. So early on, road warriors were also already told about how to hack into hotel modem lines, how to tweak their computers, and how to find power sockets where they could not be found, and so on. But that discourse, right, would not be so prominent until we reach the 90s, right? So for now, I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about another group of people, right? The Japanese semiconductor engineers. Okay, so in the 90s, engineers started to describe the worlds that portables can create. Okay, and one of the people that I've been looking at, Shigeo Makimoto, right? He is at the time the head of the Hitachi's semiconductor division, right? And a very sort of prominent figure within Hitachi. Okay, and so a lot of these engineers at the point of time were very caught on by this idea of Moore's law, right? For those of you who have studied semiconductor engineering before, you would probably know of Moore's law. It's a very famous law. The basic idea is that the number of transistors, right, that can be put on a semiconductor chip was set to double every 2 years, right? So this was not your normal kind of innovation improvement, right? Typically, things improve, but they don't leapfrog, right? So in semiconductor engineering industry, it was often described as a constant leapfrogging because essentially your transistors are doubling every year, right? Not even just increasing linearly, but doubling, right, every year. So so what happens then is that because the industry is sort of being developing, right, is sort of being is innovating so quickly, right? There was this sense amongst a lot of engineers that they needed to also create demand, right, for these new products. Okay, so again, Makimoto, right? He wrote the Digital Nomad. He is the head of Hitachi, right, and the director at Hitachi and the head of the semiconductor section, right? His second author here, David Manners. Manners was a senior editor at Electronic Weekly, right? A long-standing trade publication for electronic engineers. Okay, so when this book, Digital Nomad, was published, right? Again, if you study digital nomad, before, most likely you have heard of this book. What is actually not so often said is that who this book is for. People who read this book today often describe Makimoto as sort of a prophet, right? So he sort of prophesized how the nomadism was going to be, right? And I think this book was published in the 90s, right? So he sort of prophesized that. But actually, when you look at the book is actually not directed at users, common people, right? I mean, the common readers, like popular readers, like people like you and me. It was actually very specifically targeted to semiconductor engineers, right? So if you turn to the back, right, the blurb, you would actually see these sort of people who praise the book. And the people who praise the book are all leaders of electronic industry giants, right? So there is one of they have a Casio person, they have a Philips person, they have a Siemens person, right? So basically, this was a book addressed only at semiconductor engineering and engineers, right? And especially leaders of the engineering industry. So why? So I mean, like, what does this say? Well, what this says is that Digital Nomad is less of a self-help book and more of an engineering textbook to teach engineers what to build and how to build a world that could accommodate what to build. Yeah, so I will sort of be sort of elaborating on that a little bit more, and also just to recall again, right? Remember again that in the 80s there was this whole thing about road warriors, right? So the road warriors was about transformation of environments, and then now it sort of moves to the 90s where the engineers are also now thinking about the transformation of environments, right? And sort of the link between portable technologies and environments, right? So again here, they were sort of, the engineers were sort of struck by Moore's law and how things were developing. So, if you look at Makimoto's slides, he often would put on a slide like this, which shows like how in a period of, every 10 years, you see this calculator becoming really, really a lot smaller. So not just a bit smaller, not with just a little bit more qualities, but really almost fundamentally different machines, right? So this leads into his prime thesis about the book, right? So in Digital Nomad, he talks a lot about a variety of different things that could happen, but one of the main things he discusses is a logic of redistribution, right? A way by which the crises of the global north could be resolved by tapping into the unexploited resources and spaces of the global south, right? So if you see this particular section, for instance, he says that, in Western Europe, there were 19 million unemployed people. So it's becoming a threat to social stability to have people cut off from society, but continue to live within it, right? And so he discusses that in relation to crime rates in the West, right? And so what happens here is that he basically argues that the problems of the global north, right, now can be shifted as opportunities to the global south, to the underdeveloped global south, right? And this would, and so this would then allow the people in the global north to the problems of the global north to be sort of alleviated, right, to be relieved, right? So here, not only is the global south exploited as a site of tourism and cheap labor, it is also seen as a dumping ground for the maladjusted subjects of the first world, protected by their governments, but ultimately outsourced to the third world to manage, right? So the imaginary that they had about this was quite extensive, right? So this was not just an encouragement. So they say governments need to step in and create a policy where that they could officiate this deporting process, right? So you can be deported, right? Um, and and the people who will be working in these resorts in the global south will be the local populations, right? And they would receive economic aid while taking care of those expelled from the wealthier home countries, right? So this is that these cities, I'm quoting here, these cities could contribute handsomely to the local economy, and when necessary, the food and wine surpluses of the developed world could be delivered to supplement local resources. So quite clearly here, we see an imaginary of colonialism, not the usual imaginary we imagine around care labor, where workers from the global south are shipped to the global north, or body shop to the global north for care work, for work, different kinds of work, but how then the global south can be maintained as an environment of care, right, for the people in the global north to move in, right? So here we have what Nancy Fraser also calls a series of global care chains, right? So as Fraser observes, care is a component necessary but neglected in a scheme of capitalist production. And this contradiction often always yields what she calls a care gap that must be filled by an overtaxed social net of un and undervalued care labor. So historically, such care work has been overwhelmingly provided by women, right? Reinforced through a political economy of disposable domestics. So immigrant women from the global south who go to the global north and who become, cheap care labor by design, right? But then now portable technologies, and the important thing about then this is where the technology comes in. The portable technologies will reinforce and address this gap in a different way, right? Because essentially with portable technologies, the idea is that you could go anywhere and still remain connected to wherever you came from, right? So now people in the global north can be relocated to the global south, right? And through portable technologies, still be connected to their family and friends while receiving the care that supposedly the global south can give. So the question here, right? Why was this imaginary created, right? Histories of colonialism tells us that oftentimes the colonial relations is one of exploitation, but it's also one based around crisis. The crisis is not just in the global south that colonial relations often take place, but with the global north. Something of crisis in the global north leads them to seek out spaces to tap into and absorb within the global south, right? So this was the same period, right, when Makimoto wrote this. This was the same period where Japan was actually encountering a crisis in the semiconductor industry, right? So the global semiconductor industry revenue, right, in the 1990 to 2000 actually expanded almost fivefold, right, from 44 billion to 197 billion, right? So in a period of 10 years, the global semiconductor revenue actually just exploded 5 times, right? But then what happens is that Japan's capture of the global market actually dropped, right? So it dropped from 47% to 36%, right? Also in the 1990s period, there was a lot of other problems going on with Japan, right? There was the asset price bubble collapse. And then following that, what happened, which was unprecedented in Japan, was a layoff of engineers, right? So again, this is very rare in Japan, right? A lot of these sort of working man kind of arrangements there was that when you work in a company, you work there for life, that kind of loyalty kind of thing, right? So the retrenchment was really unheard of, right? And it was sort of the description of the moment of crisis within Japan itself. And when Makimoto wrote about this, he says that Japan's decline is attributed precisely to this inability to adapt, all right, showing up especially in the slow rates of adoption of personal computers in the country, right, which caused production capacities in Japan to become out of sync with global trends. So while, for instance, computers were becoming portable computers were becoming the main users of semiconductor chips in Europe, in the West. In Japan, the semiconductor chips were still mainly being used in consumer electronics, so like television, ovens, microwaves, right? So the rates of pickup for personal computers was slow in Japan, right? So, and for Makimoto, he argues that the next generation, as time goes on, right, the next generation of chipsets will favor power efficiency, right? So they will become even more portable, right? Essentially, so they become what he calls cool chips, right? They will be able to be very good with energy efficiency, right? And so he says that if we want to restore Japan's status in the semiconductor field, we will have to know, and I quote here, what to make rather than just how to make it. So it isn't just about knowledge of making things. He was actually prescribing something else. He was saying that we have to think about what to make. And to think about what to make also means making up a world or making up an imagination of a world that will allow this making to come true. And so we see this in the way he's often describing sort of this logic of portable computers and portable chipsets, right? So he actually often talks about this, what he calls a portable electronic translator, a PDA device, right? And the idea around this PDA device is that you could say anything you want into it, and then it would come out in the language that the local person, right, knows, right? And as this image shows, right, what is central here is the thing in the middle, the mediation, right? And the mediation, and all these terms are like really, they don't mean anything to us, right? But they're all they are terms for engineers, right? They are terms about powerful chips, right? So for instance, ULSI actually describes how many transistors can be put onto the chip, right? So if I'm not wrong, U is ultra, right? So basically it's about how chips have become more and more powerful, right? And when chips become more and more powerful, what would happen is people able to bridge language differences, but also through bridging language differences, right? Able to tap into the peoples of foreign countries. So notably here, it is a man, all right, typified by both Western as well as Japanese, right, saying, I love you, and then going through the transistor coming out as 我爱你, a Chinese translation, all right, to a woman. Interestingly, the woman does not reciprocate. What is here is a process of a one-way transmission whereby one party gets to enjoy the resources of another group, right? So we have the 90s, right? And with the book Digital Nomads by the 2000s, we have come to the modern moment of the rise of nomads, okay? So nomads actually existed prior to 2008, right? But it is most famously galvanized by that moment. And it was galvanized by that moment by this book by Timothy Ferriss. So in 2008, Timothy Ferriss published The 4-Hour Work Week, where he tells readers that there's no better time than a recession to take the plunge to work as a nomad, right? So along with a lot of lifestyle bloggers, Ferriss will bring together to mainstream culture the fantasy of the austere good life, right? So raising the possibility that people can enjoy the consumptive pleasures typified of Western lifestyles by leveraging on stronger home currencies and cheap foreign locations to live from. Okay, so for Ferriss, a lot of the discussion in this book is centered around what he calls the novel rich, right? These are the people in the West, normally who are privileged, who still have their Western clients, who then can go over to somewhere in the global South or somewhere cheaper, right? To basically use currency arbitrage because they have stronger currencies, instead of clients in the West, right? To live a good life. Right, so they have more money in these new countries they go to, and that the things that are cheaper, and so they can live a good life, right? So what Ferriss describes as the lifestyle of the novel rich, right? Others argue is an escape for the novel poor, right? So a term reserved for those not making a huge living by Western standards, but manage to scrape by because they spend their time in second or third world countries, right? I'm quoting here from this blogger, right? So again, the digital nomads really sort of come about during 2008, during the financial crisis, right? Where people were, a lot of them were out of jobs, and a lot of people in the West are out of jobs, but also I think they were sort of trying to rediscover new ways that they could live the good life without being sort of left out of it, right? Because again, all these problems around global capitalism was happening to the West. Okay, so somewhere in the 2017 onwards, I started to do field work with digital nomads, right? In Bali and Thailand. And I found this sort of logic to be really strong amongst nomads, right? So nomads would sort of tell me that it's really hard to increase your income, but it's much more possible to reduce your expenditure, right? So as one decade-long British nomad tells me, the important thing about nomadism is not its tendency whether to make you rich or poor, That's actually not it. He says that actually it is this importance is that you can make your lifestyle scalable. All right. So when you are, doing well, you can live well, but when you are doing poorly, you can live poorly. So he says that you can scale effectively in Bali, right? He says with $200 a month, you can get a room with air conditioning and a swimming pool, or months that do worse, a meal with a warung, right? Costs less than $2. Okay. So, and we know this, right? Because this by now, I think digital nomads have become really influential, right? And they have appeared, especially and because one of their favorite places is Southeast Asia. So, a lot of us may have encountered them or have at least read about them in the news and things like that. And with that, of course, comes a lot of concern about nomads, right? So for while now, people have argued that nomads are driving the prices up for locals, okay, and exacerbating inequalities in countries, right? So we see this in Portugal recently, where they say that students are not able to get housing because of nomads, right? But I think in the places I've seen as well, the sort of nomads are sort of, because they're going to Airbnb and things like that, they're sort of driving all the prices up. And then and of course it benefits some people, but it doesn't benefit others, right? So sometimes local economies become very unequal, depending on whether they can tap into this tourist economy or not, okay? But of course, other issues are that digital nomads are also seen as a problem for the climate, right? Again, because they fly around a lot, they have a huge carbon footprint. Some people argue that they are a nightmare for the climate. But I think a lot of it also comes with people arguing that digital nomads are colonial, are basically starting a new regime of colonialism, right? So I think the nomads themselves are not uncritical of their lifestyles. Some nomads are very critical of their own lifestyles and arguing that they are forwarding colonialism because they are ignoring the communities at home and abroad by sort of being selfishly sort of traveling to countries. Sometimes they even worsen the states of the country that they travel to, right? So for all these cases, basically the argument of colonialism, the fact that people can travel around and doing all these things, is there, right? It's well known. I think what is, however, less, and of course these critiques are warranted, right? But I think what they do not do is that they do not address the sort of long-standing issues of portability that we are left with. Remember in my discussion so far, I've spoken of portability as a relationship between object and environment. Portability is not simply about you being able to travel. It's also about environment being able to accommodate you. Therefore, when portable devices were invented, it is about also transforming the environment or the world to accommodate the portable devices in the way you want the world to be shaped. So portability essentially is not just something that is contained within a technology. It is a media logic, right, that has very transformative kind of considerations. So what I've wanted to do within my Nomad study was to actually broaden the discussion of the sort of challenges around digital nomads, right? I think on a surface level, it is easy to see some of the biggest issues about it, all right? But I think what is actually more challenging to understand is how nomadism has adopted the legacies of colonialism from the periods before that has sort of taken a new angle on what climate means or what environments mean at this moment. So at this point of time, I want to offer a suggestion, right? So this is not something that I've written on yet, but it's something that I've been thinking about. So one of the things that we see a lot with nomads and the way nomads describe travel is how they can travel easily and how they should go to places that best fits their environment. All right. So in Nomad List, for example, that is one of the more popular websites for digital nomads. Nomad List sort of ranks countries according to the climates, right? By climates, I don't mean just weather, but by things like cost, whether or not they are liberal or not, how fast their internet is, so on and so forth, right? So you see one ranking here in Canggu and one ranking here in Bangkok. Unsurprisingly, of course, Southeast Asia is often a lot of parts of Southeast Asia are ranked, right? Now, so in Nomad list, right, it is not just Nomad list is not really not everybody uses Nomad list, right? But Nomad list structures a particular understanding about what digital nomads is, what digital nomadism is, right? Digital nomadism is about movement from place to place, dependent on which place treats you best. This is a common saying in amongst nomads, right? You have to go to a place that treats you best, right? And this means, of course, moving to places, if it's the winter, or if it's a monsoon season, you don't want to go here, you want to go there. When it's too cold, you want to move there and not here, and so on and so forth, right? And so countries, right, are going to be able to attract nomads depending on whether or not they can fit the climate needs of what nomads have at any one point of time, right? Now, this places an interesting conundrum, right? Because countries in the global south continue to be the ones most affected by climate change, not of their own doing. There is a long legacy to colonialism and climate change that I wouldn't have time to discuss here. But of course, one of the most important things to always understand, of course, at the back of our heads, is that the modern moment of climate change is largely driven by Western industrialization, right? So a lot of times now, the problems again are not something created by the global south, but nonetheless are the ones the global south is the ones most affected because our infrastructure is not able to keep up with the rates of climate change. Also at the same time, especially in Southeast Asia, we have a lot of islands, right? And we are also very vulnerable to rising sea levels. We are very vulnerable to extreme heat and rain from the equatorial climates, right? And so in essence, there is a bigger question of whether or not we or Southeast Asia, how far Southeast Asia can continue to maintain, the premier locations for nomads, right, under such conditions of climate change, right? So we must also remember at the backdrop of this is that weather is no longer just a perk under conditions of climate change. There are increasing lots of reports. I think over just the last couple of months, a lot of alarming reports are coming out, and a lot of us are experiencing heat waves that we have never experienced before. So at the same time, scholars around work have discussed this, right? So a recent paper in Nature Communications actually wrote about this and advocated that, and this is not what they advocated, but the International Labour Organization basically says that going forward in the future, many countries will no longer be able to do work from 9 to 5. Instead, we have to start work at 5 a.m. and end at 5 p.m. The reason is that as temperatures go up, the afternoon sun will make it no longer tenable for people to do work outdoors. So mainly people who are not office workers, not in air conditioned places. And so they must shift to an earlier work time. Now, of course, this presents a lot of different problems, right? Not just even to mention the lack of sleep and things like that, but one of the key problems is that how far are we able to keep doing it, right? So this paper in Nature Communications basically argues that there is a limit to our adaptive capacities, right? That as climate keeps going up, this sort of shifting work to earlier times will not resolve the fundamental losses in productivity that are experienced, right? So what is then going to happen, especially with climate change, not just with heat, but also coming with that a lot of times with natural disasters that will become more and more common, is massive amounts of relocation and also damaged lands for people who are doing agriculture farming, for instance, and damaged lifestyles, right? There is actually some emergent work on this. Natasha Iskandar, in her book, Does Skill Make Us Human, writes about migrant workers in Qatar. And what she finds was very interesting is that there's a whole bunch of recruitment agencies emerging, targeting climate-damaged regions. So they purposely target groups that are communities that have encountered damage through climate change, and then use their desperate circumstances to recruit cheap labor by saying that, okay, you come to us, we give you a low, because pay them much more lower prices, right? And then give them visas in exchange, right? So I think Iskandar sort of charts out a very dark possibility that would happen. Hopefully this will not, sorry, it has happened, but hopefully it will not become more prevalent, right? But what we do know is that the world will increasingly be structured around the distinction between nomadism and refugeeism, right? The core of nomadism is this, right? That people will be able to travel anywhere they want, right? And escape the worst of climate change. And indeed, that has been the sort of logic in amongst the digital nomads too. Digital nomads often call themselves resilient and being able to escape the worst of climate change because they can actually move around. They don't have houses, right? Most of them, they don't own houses in vulnerable areas, and so they can move around, right? And always, therefore, do business as normal, business as usual, right? Even under conditions of climate change. However, all right, these are, of course, the privileged subjects, right? These privileged subjects are mobile, able to tap into high value networks of businesses and jobs, okay? Now, again, it is very important when we think about portability to again understand that it is not just a technological characteristic, but something deeply embedded within networks around environment, subjects, and things like that. So you can't just give someone a laptop and then they become a digital nomad. It doesn't really work this way because they may not have the visa, they may not access the same companies that can accommodate their remote work and pay them well, they may not have the capital to learn to live this lifestyle and stay in Airbnbs, or the capital to buffer themselves when things go wrong. So in other words, nomads will continue to be a particular group of pretty privileged individuals, right? And who can, maneuver and be resilient in a condition of climate change. But most of the locals who, in Makimoto's argument, were the locals supposed to care for these nomads, right? These privileged people of the West. These locals will be the ones worst affected by climate change and may have to be relocated. Essentially, then, portability has created not just mobility, but it has created a world system that supports one group at the expense of the other. Portability has embedded the relations of colonialism, which is fundamentally a relationship of vulnerability, that now has become normalized in our use of things. So I'm gonna end my my talk here, right? But I hope that I've made my point clear. One of the key arguments again that I've been always sort of recirculating and going back to is the question of what is and how should we understand portability? Is portability a technological characteristic or is it not? So what I've done in this presentation is try to link up the relationships of digital coloniality with portability to highlight that our technology use, while seemingly neutral, actually embeds a long history around portability and continues to resonate today. Not only, of course, is nomadism popular, not only, of course, is climate change real, the issues of semiconductor chips manufacture has taken on precedence in the last couple of months. I don't even think it's that long ago. So a lot of things continue to be very relevant and worth thinking about. So with that, thank you so much, and I appreciate. I mean, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Otherwise, you can email me at the email here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ranyi Hong, for your very interesting presentation. It is actually very interesting for me to learn that the history of portability of digital technology and how it turns out to be such a complex issues that are related to many issues such as climate change, as you mentioned, and also especially digital coloniality. And now I want to mark the time that people has been waiting for, and that is the discussion. We now can have a full 25 minutes of discussions. And to all the participants, you can join our discussion by writing your questions in the chat box, or you can also use the raise hand feature. And now I will open the first maybe 3 questions. So if anyone would like to ask questions, you can use the raise hand feature. Okay, so first we have Ibu Meli Fauzia. So to Bu Meli, you can open your mic and share your questions. Sorry, Bu Meli, you're still on mute? Yes.
Okay, I see. Based on your story about the invention of technology, I'm sure that to produce portable technology is need many trial and errors. Yeah. And I think it just did by the creative person. But the reality, yeah, in our country, so many young people using technology, yeah, and digital as the yesterday explanation from Professor Merlin is only as user. Yeah. So how to encourage the young people, yeah, to have the character, what is it? Try to develop their character to invent, yeah, some product or some, yeah, the creation, not only as user like that. And then that the culture influenced the character of the person to be the inventor. That's all. Yeah, because Mr. What is it? Forget. Yeah, using Western Europe as sample. Is it different culture with Indonesia?
Thanks for your question, Lily. I think that's a really important question, right? Technology, entrepreneurship, technology invention, right, really differs from country to country, right? So I think that's something we have to understand. I have not actually done work on specifically entrepreneurship culture within Indonesia, right? So I can only sort of gesture towards it, and I hope that that answer would maybe perhaps spark some ideas, right? I think one of the more important things to think about when we okay, so when I was speaking to a lot of digital nomads, right? Some digital nomads were interested to give back to communities, right? And by giving back, they mean by that they want to spark, maybe say they want to start coding courses, or they want to encourage local entrepreneurship, right, to develop. And I think that in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? But I think the problem is that a lot of times entrepreneurship culture cannot just be taken from the West and just applied to the South, and like that, because what invention has to do is to work within the local context, right? And so understand the local norms and local cultures. And I think that is actually very important. I feel like when we are talking about entrepreneurship, it's very important to then highlight local entrepreneurs, right? And what local entrepreneurs have done. Okay, so I'm not so sure in the case of Indonesia, but I'm sure that there are certain heroes, right, who have done a lot for local communities, right, as well as Indonesian society. And I think those people, entrepreneurs, needed to be celebrated more compared to, say people, sort of entrepreneurs in the West, right? I think those things, that is really an important thing. Not necessarily to say that when doing that, then we will sort of circumvent the sort of histories of around colonialism. I think that is a more complicated topic. But again, I think the understanding and appreciation of the local is very important because it at least provides a starting point, right? I think, for instance, my work with platforms, right? I'll shift a little bit to talk about platforms. Has shown that generally when platforms come locally, right? When food delivery platforms, when private vehicle hire platforms, when they spring up locally, they tend to produce more equitable kinds of conditions compared to when Uber comes in, that kind of situation. So I think that there is an element that I think might be helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
thank you. Maybe for the second questions, anyone would like to ask questions? Yeah, maybe you can, anyone, you can raise your hand or maybe use the raise hand feature. Okay, so Bapak Muhammad Ihsananur, you can.
All right. Okay, so thank you for having me.